Hi, this is Russ Anderson. Today I'm going to be showing filter-based stabilization of long 360 VR shots by breaking them into pieces. Now it's also possible to do stabilization using full 3D solves, again in pieces, but that's the subject for a different tutorial. So we're going to start out by opening up our shot. It has about 18,000 frames to it. Now, if this was the very first time that you opened a movie file, you'd probably be sitting here for a couple of minutes even, while SynthEyes has to go through and index the file to figure out where each frame is. And once it's done that, it saves away a little file that lets it reopen the file subsequent times very quickly. But that first time, it does have to index the file. These days, everybody's worried about playing videos on YouTube and not really for doing visual effects. So we've got the shot here opened up, and one point about shots for stabilization is that you want to leave plenty of frames at the beginning and at the very end so that there's room for the stabilization to have additional data on either side, frames before and frame after, to drive the stabilization. Because there are only subsequent frames for the frames at the very beginning, the first couple of frames are a lot noisier. Similarly, the last couple of frames are a lot noisier. So you leave plenty of extra frames at the beginning and the end, and then ultimately you're going to cut them off. So that's just a general planning note for stabilizing shots. So this is footage from a Ricoh Theta S, and it does have inertial stabilization built in. So if you thought that the inertial stabilization was going to be a magic cure-all, it's not, but it is helpful, and in fact it's makes the tracking here a bit easier. So if your footage was from a camera that doesn't have any stabilization at all, then it might be notably even bouncier than that. So the idea here is that we're going to break this shot up into individual pieces. And we're going to do that using a script. And that script is actually written using SynthEyes' Synthia Advanced Assistant technology. And you can see that here. And just to highlight a couple things in here, there's the number 2000 here is the number of frames in each section that we're going to produce. And that number has just been picked to correspond to roughly a good number that fits into the RAM cache of my particular machine here. So if you've got a whole lot of RAM in your machine, you might make it larger, or you might make it smaller, depending. Similarly, this number 100 is the amount of overlap between the successive sections. And just like you need to have some head and tail of the shot, the overall shot, you need to have some overlap between the sections so that you can have a nice smooth stabilization across the boundary, and everything doesn't get all wonky right at the boundary. So the easy thing to do is just adjust these numbers in the script if you need to. So the first step to this is going to be to edit the shot, and we're going to set up our initial 2000 frame section here as the end frame. Now this is an inclusive thing, so we wind up with 2001 frames in the overall section. And we're going to be replicating basically this file for all the succeeding pieces. So whatever we can set up here will save us trouble down the line in each little section. So we're going to go and set up the number of trackers per frame and the total tracker count to numbers that are typical for 360 VR shots. And now it's not overwhelmingly large. So we did that. So that will be carried through all of the succeeding sections. It is possible to have these sections submitted for batch tracking. If you're going to do that, on the solver panel, you'd set the solving mode to refine, which is actually a little refined trick, and that we don't want to disable the camera outright, because if it's disabled, nothing's going to happen. So we set it to refine, and it's going to wind up saying, oh, it's not solved, there's nothing to do. So the solving part won't have, spend any time doing the solve when it's being processed in the batch mode. So with this, we're going to do a save as. We're going to put all these pieces into a little temporary folder here for demo purposes. So that's our first file saved away. And now we're going to run our script. So it's out here in the 360 VR area.
I am Cynthia.
Cynthia is going to fire up to be able to execute the script.
Okay.
And now you look down here on the time bar, and you'll see that now the range of the shot goes from 1900 up to 4000. So this is the second piece of the shot. And the file name has been changed also. Basically, Cynthia just used the save next version operation in SynthEyes to do that. So, we've got create next piece. We can just repeat the last scripting operation using a shift 1. So we're just going to do that a bunch of times. So here's our 3900 and up.
Okay. 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 Okay.
Now we've made it all the way up to the end of the shot that's out here, a bit past 17,000 frames. So now we're ready to go and process each of these individual files. And we're going to need to do a bunch of steps. The first step, let's just roll back to the very first one. And here they all are lined up. So here's our first section. And the first step is going to be to go and run the auto tracker. Note that we're not doing the track and solve, just because this is a filter-based stabilization. We're just running the auto track part of it. So this takes a little while as it both is reading in the file and processing the images as it goes along. Now it's gone and finished up that auto tracking process. And you see why it can be valuable to have that part of it done as part of a batch process on each of the individual sections. But the following process now is what you're going to want to do most likely as a human supervised sort of operation. So you'll see we do have all the frames loaded up now. We can scrub through them, and you can see all the trackers that have been put out there. So at this point, depending on what sort of quality level you want for the whole thing, you can do as much or as little work as you want. What I'm going to do is just take out all that blip information there to cut the size of the file ultimately. And you could go and look at the graph editor and take out any trackers that look to be bad, or if you know that there are any actors or other objects moving around in your scene that might cause trouble, you can remove them at this point in time. But once you've done that, now you're going to bring up the image preparation dialog, normally the P key, and we're going to set up the stabilizer. So as we said, this is the filtering type stabilization, so we're going to change both of these settings to the filter mode, and now we're going to go and set the frequency of the filtering so it's down at 1/2 of a hertz. So we're setting it fairly low. One thing to keep in mind is that the lower you go with that cut frequency, the more frames that will be involved. So it'll start to be a bit laggy, and also you'll need to have a longer overlap between the different pieces in order to have smooth transitions. If you need to, you can actually go and animate this cut frequency value for different parts of the shot. If there's some particular problem area where you want to keep it as stable as possible, you can go and do that. And once you do that, SynthEyes will go and start producing the new frames that are the result of that stabilization. And I can start playing that, and you'll see the trackers are moving around kind of wildly from the original footage, but the images now are a whole lot more stable. And again, you can look at the graph editor and see if there are any particular jumps that need to be addressed at this point. Now, you can go through and look at this all you want if you like. You can actually go and, I'm going to hit the P key there to bring up the image preprocessor. You can use the adjust panel here to make some adjustments on what the facing direction is of the camera and whatnot at this point as well. Well, once you've done that, now you're ready to do an export of the tracking data. So I'm going to use a 360 VR export, and this is just a text file, and you save that away, and you can actually do that before SynthEyes has produced any of these frames. You don't have to wait for all the frames to be produced. It's just a simple text file that has all of the tracking data in it. So now at this point, we're going to switch to show the results of that whole operation for each of the files. So this is the sort of setup that you come up with. So I've got each of these files is saved away, and for each of the files, I have the little text file that has the stabilization data in it for that particular piece of the shot. Now, one that I want to take a look at specifically, and we'll just go open it up now. This is the very final piece, and you might have noticed earlier that some crazy stuff happens at the end of the shot because the camera person for some reason decided to wave the camera around in circles a bit. So it's particularly not stable, and we could go and address that a bit probably by going and culling some of the trackers. The trackers that are on things that are close to the camera produce perspective effects that can throw off the stabilization a bit. So ideally with the stabilization, you do want to use trackers that are far away, things that are out in the horizon. So when you have a more problematic area, it's a good idea to go and remove the closer trackers. Now we have another option here that I'll just show, which is to go and use a full 3D solve. And we can actually do that with this particular case easily enough, just because it's the last section, and we're going to rely on the fact that when you're doing the stabilization, basically on average the stabilizer is doing nothing, so that the net stabilization is 0, 0, 0. So we can go and do a full 3D solve and splice it into the beginning, or to the end of the previous shot, if the 3D version of it starts out at 0, 0, 0 as well. So I'm just opening up the solve version of that last section, and you can see that here. And I'll point out that this takes somewhere around 12 minutes, I think, on this 2009 era Mac Pro to do the solve. And you can see that up here there's the whole entire camera path, and all of the trackers have been determined as well, and we've applied the computed camera path as the source of the stabilization. That's using the stabilize from camera path after the 3D solve was completed. So you can see the whole camera solve went on for a little while. So we did this way just for this one particular section because it was a bit wonkier than the rest of it. And like I said, the step that made it possible to easily integrate with the previous ones is that I use the camera, the whole mode, to set the orientation of the camera to 0, 0, 0 at the beginning of the shot. And that way it matches up with the average 0, 0, 0 of the stabilizers. So this works one time at the end, because typically by the end of the shot you're looking in some other different direction, and you can't magically just glue things together. You're going to have this big transition right across the boundary. So that's a kind of different topic, and that's what you do and what you address when you're doing full 3D solves for all the sections. But again, like I said, this isn't really the place for that, but I wanted to throw in this one example of what you can do with the 3D solve, just because this one particular portion of the shot is really just very wonky and terrible. And yet then we can go and use the full 3D solve to straighten out something that's really rotating quite a lot. If you look at the camera mount here, you'll see that it's kind of spinning around all sorts of different ways. And our image is really pretty stable, and could be more so if you actually went and looked at it in detail. Alrighty, so now we've got, again, our whole set of data, and all they did was then take the stabilization data and export the stabilization data from the solve version of the shot. So we've got the LWalk 1 through LWalk 9 with the stabilization data for each different section of the shot, and the stabilization has this 100 frame overlap region between them. So at this point we can go back and we'll open up our shot again. Here's the entire shot, and we'll go to import. I'm going to do blend stabilizations. So this is going to do what it sounds like. We're just going to give it the first file and it's going to go and it looks for the additional files, and they all have to be named sequentially, LWalk 1, 2, 3, whatever, whatever just like it was an image sequence, it's a sequence of stabilization data files. So that stabilization data is now present throughout the entire shot. So you can see there's really quite a lot of it sitting around. So now you have a couple of different things that you can do. First, you can go and adjust the pointing direction throughout the entire shot, again using the image preprocessor adjust tab to go and refine what happens throughout the length of the shot. When you're done with that, if you're satisfied with what you've got, you can then write the sequence directly out of SynthEyes using the save sequence here. You could write yourself a brand new movie directly out of SynthEyes. Alternatively, you have the option to go and send the stabilization data to a compositing package such as AfterEffects, and you can use it either plain AfterEffects with the SynthEyes supplied plugin, or you could use the metal SkyBox plugins in AfterEffects, or you could go to HitFilm. And in either case, you're relying on that compositing package to be able to do the 360 VR stabilization. It's doing the warping part of it using data provided by SynthEyes. Let's go export the data to SkyBox. So we'll select File, Export, and 360 VR. We'll select that SkyBox thing, and we'll just export a JavaScript file, and this is going to get read directly by AfterEffects. We've got the option set up for AfterEffects to just run it immediately. So AfterEffects was sitting in the background doing nothing, just at the new project level, and now it's just brought in that stabilization data, and you'll see that there's a metal skybox rotate sphere effect on the original footage. So now if we just jump out here into the middle, we can play it and see the stabilized version. So the advantage of sending the data from SynthEyes to the compositing application is that it allows you to combine your grading and adding of additional elements inside of the compositing application with the stabilization. So you don't have to do a compression and decompression stage that you would do if you had to write the file out of SynthEyes and then read the stabilized version into AfterEffects. So by combining them all within the compositing application, you get some higher final image quality. So just in case you forgot what the original footage looked like, let's just go and we'll bring down the original footage, and we'll just set up a little mask here. So now we've got half and half. So now you're seeing the original on the left and the stabilized version on the right. And I think you'll agree that the version on the right is going to be a heck of a lot more watchable inside your 360 VR viewer. So it just goes to show that with SynthEyes and the stabilization capability, you can go and take some footage that would otherwise be very difficult to watch, make something that's really very nice and watchable, that provides a solid relationship between the outside world and what you're seeing in the virtual world. So thanks for watching.